Good morning and welcome to this Airmic Academy, for which we are extremely fortunate today to have AXA XL presenting on Are You Ready for Property Renewals? Our three panelists this morning are Timothy Smith, Head of Client Management at AXA XL. Tim has nearly 30 years of experience in insurance and has held roles spanning across claims, underwriting, and business development. We also have Jonathan Salter, Head of Property Risk Consulting, who's based in London and leads property risk consulting globally at AXA XL Risk Consulting, as well as machinery breakdown and additional responsibility for the technical team. And Chris Maguire, who's responsible for account consulting across the UK, Ireland, and the Northern European region, covering multiple business lines. Today, we're going to discuss how you get the most out of your property renewal, what insurers are really looking for, what gives you a good indicator of your risk management programs, and how you can present this to best effect. So without further ado, I will hand over to Tim to take us away.
So good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. Before we kick off, I just wanted to extend thanks from AXA XL to Airmic and its members, to John, Julia, Alex, Susie, and the whole team for such a fantastic event last week. It was a great event showcasing what is possible through collaboration, a topic I covered last month on one of these sessions, and one that we're going to look to expand on today. So thank you for all of your engagement with AXA XL. It was hugely appreciated, but especially thanks to the Airmic team for putting on such a fantastic event. So in following that, in today's agenda, I'm not going to go through those. We've touched on who you've got with us. I will just briefly ask the team just to introduce themselves. So Jonathan.
Thanks, Tim. So yeah, as Alex said, I'm Jonathan. I look after, well, as of tomorrow, I look after risk consulting globally for AXA XL, not just property. So we've got a team of around about 400 consultants in something like 23 countries, looking at risk management, working with clients and working with underwriters. And I guess Chris.
Thanks, Tim. So I'm Chris Maguire. I'm the risk consulting country manager for the UK, Ireland, and the Northern Europe region, and I work closely with Jonathan and the rest of his team.
Excellent, thanks guys. So firstly, these two are the stars of the show in reality, but I'm going to kind of set them up in terms of what we're going to talk about, the thinking that we have in terms of an insurer, then pass over to Jonathan and Chris around that risk consultancy piece, which is fundamental to the session today. We'll touch on how we manage and recommendations, and then the trends that we're seeing across the market in terms of many of our clients, and then in terms of what you can expect as takeaways, and hopefully we'll fulfill these for you. So knowing fundamentally timelines, I think this is a common theme that we're seeing quite a lot at the moment, and something touched on again last week, which I'll come back to. Once we propose recommendations, what does an insurer do with those, and how does that influence our decision making? A review of some of the most common recommendations that we see across the portfolio, and our experience of how is the best way to address those. And then a common theme again from last week is technology, and how can technology be used to managing recommendations, and also how we use it for benchmarking data and what we see from future trends and how that affects the renewal process. But it wouldn't be a session without just touching on where we are at the moment. Undoubtedly, market dynamics are in play here. The market continues to harden, but that shouldn't be the panacea of every conversation. COVID, although not referenced on this slide, it really doesn't need referencing. It's impactful to everything that we're doing, both from a risk perspective, but also from a collaboration perspective. The performance of a number of property and casualty insurers consistently with combined ratios of 100%, over 100%. So it's important that we also deliver to our shareholders. And then how do you differentiate your risk? What are insurers looking to see? How do we collaborate around renewal? Which is, that's been a huge focus and a lot of discussion and debate. And I'm sure many of you joined the harsh market session last week, which, Tracy, Josh and Scott touched on this and around that dialogue and how insurers need to step up to the plate, how we can work with brokers. So we're going to address some of those points as well, because I think that's really important to touch on. The market is difficult and we understand that. But then from a property perspective, what goes into an underwriting view? Okay, what goes into that little black box that you know, is seen as the panacea of how we approach risk? But in reality, it's a lot more complex than that. And this is why it gets to the heart of why it's important that you invest the time in your submission. You know, we understand it's important that each risk is considered and priced on its merits, and therefore the quality of information that you provide is key in differentiating your risk and portraying the risk that allows underwriters to make informed decisions. For us in managing a portfolio, differentiated risk will be considered, especially in situations where there's limited capacity for specialist extensions or coverages available. So the market dynamics we do understand, but we also have to understand your risk and the presentation of your risk. And in these times, and from COVID, and we've talked about how data gathering can be such a challenge, we understand that. We understand information gathering process is a timeline for you that can be indefinite. It can be the annual rolling cycle of feeling, I've just finished renewal and we kick off again. And brokers and underwriters need to ensure they work with you to get that relevant information. And you can see there that the engineering review is in the middle. And you could argue that that's at the heart of what we look to review. So it's important for us to focus on risk improvement and mitigation, what activity is taking place to manage and mitigate risk. And then this information is key in differentiating risk as presented to us. So that combined data review and engineering review allows us to consider and communicate both pricing and capacity. And that's going to be at the heart of what we do. So what are the considerations that we're going to share with you today from a risk control perspective? And that's what the focus of this session is going to be. So I'm going to pass over to Chris now, who will talk in more detail around the risk consulting cycle.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Tim. So if we look at this slide here, this shows us the risk consulting cycle, as Tim mentioned there. And this all begins, of course, with the prospect data being provided by the underwriter to one of the account consulting team. So this data would typically include documents such as previous carrier reports or loss data, as well as the recommendation status and updates. And you'll see that the recommendation status and updates is a very important part of any of these risk management programs. And finally, on top of that, we would also have the current schedule of values, so we can look at the sites and identify what are those key sites and what would be the key loss drivers as well. So the risk consulting team will undertake the account review, and they're going to be working very closely alongside the underwriter to identify what those key risk drivers are, and also the critical locations within the program itself. This could be from the prospect data provided, but it could also be taking into account other sources. Examples there would include things such as market presentations or insurer days, where it's been possible for us to actually physically get on site and see the site firsthand. Following on from this review, the underwriter will use the analysis that's provided within their pricing models, and they can then provide their proposal back to the broker or to the client directly. And this would include a proposal for risk consulting services, so what we would be looking to do as part of that risk consulting program over the year ahead, and the sites that we would be looking to visit and the frequency with which we'd be looking to visit those locations. Then, if we're successful and we're able to bind the account, the survey program would commence. And once those surveys have been scheduled and undertaken, the data is going to be shared back to the client in multiple forms, okay? So that could include loss prevention survey reports or risk management portals that we're going to talk about a bit later in the presentation. And then finally, at the end of the program, we've got the stewardship presentation, where we can sit back and we can actually see, okay, how has the risk improved over the course of the year, and what sort of trends have we been able to see as we've been going through. But it's important to remember that it shouldn't just be left until the end of the program before we spot these key trends and we have these discussions. Any good program is critical that we've got an open dialogue between the sites, the risk managers, risk consulting and underwriting throughout the course of the year. If we move on to the next slide, we can see the process from a risk consulting standpoint, and this is It's not a fixed timeline in terms of how things have to work, but it gives us a good idea as to the timing process that we would normally work to. So the process starts well ahead of renewal. In this example, we've said 2 months prior to the renewal date. And the important thing is to ensure that we've got a seamless transition between the previous insurer and the new insurer that's taking on the programme. So we have to be ready to hit the ground running from day one. As such, it's important that we inform the sites about the new carrier and contract procedures well ahead of time and ensure that factors such as impairment handling and project reviews are transferred ahead of this date and so that they're ready for the programme inception. Historical data can be pulled into new risk management systems to ensure that no data is lost. And online sessions can be held to ensure that people are able to become familiar with those systems prior to the data being uploaded. Sorry, I've just lost the screen. Okay, perfect, thank you. Once the survey programmes is finally agreed and the target sites have been identified, the programme can commence, and normally we try to spread these visits throughout the course of the year, particularly when we're looking at large programmes. It's important that we don't have them all clustered at the start, the middle, or the end of the programme. Following on from visits, there'll be follow-up calls, and that can help to clarify any outstanding issues that maybe have come up once the site has had a chance to properly review the report and to discuss it internally. And we can also use that as an opportunity to discuss the recommendations and their thoughts around them once they've had an opportunity to properly consider them and look into potential solutions. If there are any recurring themes that have been identified, let's take, for example, a lack of awareness around proper testing procedures of fire pumps or hot work operations, then they could be addressed by having training sessions. And normally we would try to conduct these once the programme's had some time to bed in and we've been able to start to identify areas where that training would be beneficial. At the end of the programme, we've already discussed the stewardship presentation, but that would be conducted, and that gives us an opportunity to reflect, as I said before, on the sites that have been undertaken, the visits that we've carried out over the previous months, any trends that have been identified and progress towards that recommendation completion. At that stage, we can also look towards the coming year and to discuss what is the plan for the surveys. What are the sites that we need to get back and see? And that could be because they're high value or because they were particularly poor in terms of a risk standpoint. Or it could be that there were a number of projects that were ongoing and we want to stay on top of them and help work with the client to ensure that those do move in a proper manner that is considering of the risks that are present. But it's important to not just consider the programme in the course of 1 year. If we consider that this is a multi-year programme and we do need to be considering which sites we want to see over the course of a number of years and not just looking at it on a single basis. So when considering property risk, a mix of factors are evaluated by risk consulting. This would include physical elements, for example, the construction of the building and the protection system, human element factors such as self-inspection or pre-emergency planning, and also NatCat analysis. And it's important when we're considering locations not only to focus on the risk to the building, but also the process and the products contained. For example, are they susceptible to smoke or heat damage? And once we consider this, risk consulting can then use their knowledge of the industry and these processes to assist underwriting with fully understanding the risk and the potential exposure as well. So if we move to the next slide, we can see that there are 10 risk factors that we would look at. Touching on each of these briefly, we've got risk management first of all. So it's a good level of risk management at the sites. And do the sites view risk management as important? Sprinkler protection, we would consider factors such as the design of the system. Is it suitable for the commodity and the storage arrangements? And what is the percentage of coverage that is provided to the site? If we look at pre-emergency planning, what plans are in place in order to deal with an event should one occur? With surveillance, we're wanting to consider what type and level of fire detection is provided, but also what security systems are in place and are they appropriate for the type of risk that we're looking at. Other protection would consider systems such as gaseous suppression systems within IT server rooms, or if we were looking at, for example, a kitchen, it could consider the suppression systems are over the frying pieces of equipment there. When we talk about hazards, we're looking at any special process hazards that should be considered. How are these monitored and how are they controlled? Moving through, we've got water supply. So is there a private or a public water supply? And what are the pressure and flow characteristics, as well as how much water is actually available in terms of duration? With our storage, is there high-piled storage at the facility? How is this laid out? How is it protected? When we look at fire department, where's the nearest fire department, and what's the availability of that fire department to actually assist us with a fire should one break out? So is it a private brigade? Is it a public brigade? Is it full-time, or is it a retained fire service that's there? Construction is obviously a very key element to consider when we're talking about property risks. So is it non-combustible construction, or are there combustible panels present? And also, how would a fire spread if we were to have a fire within that facility? And the final point that we've got there on the slide is business interruption. So are there business continuity plans in place? Are these regularly tested? And how are they likely to stand up in the event of an event occurring? So you can see that there are a number of factors that we are looking into, and it's important that each one of these factors is taken and considered and properly evaluated. And at the end of that, each individual factor will be given a score, and that score will then calculate up in order to give each site a score and each account a score. And that's the basis of the evaluation that we're giving to these particular sites. It says there in the slide that when we don't have information, we have to err on the side of caution. And that's important, particularly when we have reports which don't contain full risk management information. If we don't know the construction of the building, then we have to assume that it's the worst case, and that case would be a combustible building. So with that, I'll hand over to Jonathan. He'll talk about some of the common recommendations that we have.
Thanks, Chris. So I think Chris has built the picture there of the cycles that we have and the timelines that we have. And really, this is all about the data. So the more data that you have, the richer your data set, the better your understanding of your risks, the better your broker can understand them, and the better your insurer can understand them. So assuming that we bind the risk, we would look to work with you as a client, with the broker, to make sure that we get the right survey program in place. So the survey program is our basic start for data capture. As Chris said, it could be key locations, it could be locations where there are changes planned or happening. It could be ones that show up as perhaps having a poorer risk profile. We can extend these to key suppliers, or we've got tools that allow us to have a greater penetration across the portfolio. But it's all about capturing as much data in a timely fashion as possible. On top of that, we've got project and plan reviews. So we need to make sure that if you're doing work, if you're building extensions, if you're putting in new lines, if you're using new protection, that we can help you manage those so that they are acceptable across the whole of the insurance market. And really, the survey program is an opportunity for us to work together to make sure that we can capture the key data. Now, part of that key data is recommendations. Recommendation response is key. We make recommendations based on the expertise that we have, based on where losses come from, and it's critical, absolutely critical, that there is as much information flowing backwards and forwards about recommendation response, recommendation completion, because when we come to stewardship reports, market presentations, and making the data available to everyone that's a key stakeholder in this, these are the kind of questions they're asking. Because if we think back to what Chris spoke about in terms of how we assess the risk, it's about understanding that risk management appetite, and recommendation response and recommendation completion would be a key KPI there. So if we have a look at the next slide and start to look at some of the recommendations that are out there, we thought this would be quite interesting for you to have a look at. Broadly in our database, that at any one time, there's something like 90,000 open recommendations. So we do, as a team, something like 8,500 visits a year. So you can understand the kind of magnitude there. So this is probably quite a good representation of what most insurers would be like. And what I think is really interesting about this slide particularly is that you can see that recommendations address deficiencies. We, as I said, develop them from an understanding of every claim, and they address both frequency and severity type of deficiencies. But as I said, what I think is really interesting is that if you look at sprinkler protection, and you heard Chris talk about hazard protection, so special hazards, you're probably looking at about a third of the recommendations would perhaps require capital expenditure, but certainly 43% in there are management programs, and if you add up the rest, we're somewhere closer to sort of 70% that are human element type of recommendations. And I think that's quite interesting, because often we think that when we're talking about property, it's all about sprinkler protection, but this would suggest that it's not just about the sprinkler protection. Sprinkler protection, very important, and these kind of longer capex type of recommendations we don't expect to be completed overnight. But again, if we move on to the next slide and drill into what we're looking at from management programs, again, you've got a very broad spread here of the type of recommendations that get made. So it goes across all of the simple to do things in terms of equipment inspections, in terms of maintenance, in terms of housekeeping, and right down to controller contractors. Now, in a couple of slides time, Chris will take us through some of the easy wins and some of how you address this. But again, I think my observation around these kind of frequency human element type of recommendations would certainly be that as a property insurer, we would be looking for a reasonably rapid address of these type of recommendations. They should be low cost or no cost, and all of these address these high frequency types of loss. And you'll all be familiar with the story that every large loss starts as a very small incident, and there's an unfortunate chain of events that happens of things that aren't normally in place. Contractors are on site, they're doing hot work, there's waste piled up somewhere where it's never normally there, the sprinklers are perhaps impaired for maintenance, whatever it is, it's always a chain of events. So these are very important recommendations, and again, to tie back to what Chris said, these are the kind of things that we're looking at account review stage, whether it's prospect or renewal. So if we look at the next slide, again, it drills slightly deeper into the hazard protection. Other hazards could be, as Chris said, a complete mix of things. So these could be special hazards on particular lines. So it could be large commercial fryers, it could be paint rooms in automotive. Those are the kind of things we're looking at there. But again, you can see, the trend around flammable liquids, electrical, all of these are where we see losses coming from, and that's why we make those recommendations against those particular deficiencies. The top 4 causes of loss that we see broadly are around arson, contractors, hot work, and electrical. So those are the ones that we tend to address. So at this point, I'll pass back to you, Chris, to drill into some good common sense about how we can get these recommendations completed.
Thanks, Jonathan. So a couple of the numbers there, just to reiterate, that Jonathan pulled out from those slides. So we had 43% of those recommendations were relating to management programs, and 70% were related to human element type programs, okay? Whenever we look at the first slide that Jonathan showed on the drill down, we saw that over 30% of those recommendations focused on 3 human element type of recommendations, and those were hot work, impairments, and housekeeping. So those are the 3 that I'm going to speak to you about over this next few slides. So hot work is one of the key recommendations that we see. It's a very frequent recommendation, but it's also one of the leading causes whenever we consider industrial fires. So prior to undertaking any hot work operations, and that would include things such as cutting, welding, or grinding, we have to be looking at the area and the job in question, and first of all, making an assessment. Is it possible for us to take this work either outside or take it to a dedicated hot work area? Or is it even possible that we could be using different methods? So do we really have to undertake this by a hot work method of working? Where we've identified that those hot work operations must still be undertaken, then we need to be making sure that we've got a permit in place and that permit process is followed properly. Look, a proper hot work permit is going to contain a checklist that will ensure factors such as combustible materials are removed and that firefighting measures are available and suitable. And also, and this is one of the key points, that there's a post-work fire watch period that's included. Now, hot work embers have been known to smoulder for many hours following hot work operations, and it's important that we do consider that there's a fire watch period that needs to be undertaken, and whilst it can seem excessive, it is an important step within these operations. And Jonathan also touched upon contractors. It's really important that contractors aren't overlooked, and anybody that's undertaking hot work at the facility is held to the same standards that you've got for any hot work within your facility itself. And they've got to follow those steps outlined within the permit as well. If we move on, we can look at housekeeping. Again, this is another common recommendation that we see, and it's one of the first things that we notice whenever we go onto a site. There's temporary situations that we often come across whereby there's maybe pallets that are stored up against a building, or there could be combustible materials stored within a server room. Whilst these are only temporary situations, it might just be there for a couple of weeks. Whenever we're looking at a fire, that is likely when it's going to occur, and that can be the missing link in terms of having a situation which is able to escalate and then eventually cause a loss. So poor housekeeping, it adds to your combustible load within the facility. It can delay fire detection, and it can also obstruct firefighting efforts whenever they're trying to actually tackle the fire. But as we said, it's one of the key things that we notice whenever we go onto a site. So if we arrive onto a site and the grounds are nicely landscaped, and whenever we go inside, the facility is clear, the aisles within the warehousing are clear, and everything's properly within the racking, it gives you a good impression as to what the risk management is going to be like in that facility and the pride that the workers take in terms of their actual site. If we arrive there and everything's overgrown, there's pallets stacked up against the side of the building, the forklift charging trucks area is full of pallets and combustible materials, then not only do we consider that to be a hazard, but it gives us a very good insight into the management of that facility as well. The final one that we're going to quickly look at is impairments. And first of all, what counts as an impairment? So we normally say that any fire protection or detection system that's due to be taken offline for a period, normally over 8 hours or covering more than one shift, should be reported as part of an impairment process. That said, there could also be non-planned impairments. An example of that could be something like a burst water main pipe, which would cause part of the sprinkler system to be isolated. And these should be reported as well. Now, a successful impairment program is going to ensure that downtime is monitored and tracked, and also that the systems are brought back online, as soon as possible. We've all heard about cases whereby a system's been taken offline for some reason and it's been forgotten about and not reinstated. And that's one of the key things that we're looking to address whenever we're looking at an impairment management program. Now, under normal circumstances, most sites would have at least one impairment per year. So it's not a case of having no impairments is a good sign. In fact, it's the opposite. We would be expecting to see at least 1 or 2 impairments for a site on an annual basis. And for larger sites, this could be considerably more. So we should really be making sure that all sites are reporting impairments and they're managing them properly. And that will help to ensure that these systems, whenever they do have to be taken offline, are reinstated properly, and your facility is able to benefit from the systems that you've got in place. We also talk about fire protection systems and the testing of these systems. And this is important that systems are tested properly and any inspections that are supposed to be carried out are undertaken. An example that I like to use is whenever we consider fire pumps that aren't started up on a regular basis, and we see sites that spend huge amounts of capital in terms of getting fire protection systems in place, but then they neglect to actually test those systems whenever they are properly installed. If we're not testing the systems, then you've got no idea if they're actually going to start up and work whenever you have to call on them. And the example would be, if we think about your car, if you use it every day, the chances are that it will start and run quite happily. But if we leave it for 2, 3, 4 months, you wouldn't be as sure that it would start up first time and be dependable whenever you needed it the most. So it is very important to ensure that those testing systems are in place. And if you've already spent the capital of getting these systems installed onto your site, you should be spending the time and the resource to make sure that they are able to run properly. Okay. With that, I'll pass back over to Jonathan to talk about some of the factors within the risk consulting profiles.
Thanks, Chris. So what the slide here shows you is the transition to the future that we're trying to achieve at AXA XL at the moment. Some of it's real and working, some of it's in process. I know this next statement sounds a bit like something you'd hear on a credit card advert, but I appreciate other systems are available. We saw a lot of them at the Airmic Festival last week. Talk to your broker, talk to your insurer, talk to independents, but I can only talk to you about what I'm familiar with in terms of the AXA XL piece over the next few slides. This slide is really talking about site forward, so that's our main data display to you as clients and underwriters. And there's a whole host of different data that flows into there to try and aggregate it so that you've got one place where you can look and see the same data that you see is the data that we as risk consultants and our underwriters see. And across the bottom, I won't go through them all, but there's lots of different types of analysis and data that we're trying to get to flow into the system. But if we have a look at the next slide, what we actually have in terms of site forward is, if we could just flick that slide on, please, Matt. What we actually have is mostly survey data at present, as well as feeds in from things like our global risk map tool. So I think this is all about data confidence, that one version of the truth. It's about the flow of information between us as an insurer and you as a client and your broker. It's about having effective responses to the questions, and I guess the questions are the recommendations. What's happening with the recommendations? We're trying to save time. We're trying to have fewer spreadsheets. We're trying to make it easier to have that conversation about where are we with what, and certainly to have that better data quality in that timely fashion is key to what we've been discussing. But if we look specifically at recommendations on this slide, we can see that as a client or as the underwriter, you can drill in real time and start to understand the recommendation profile. And again, you know, every click takes you into the next level of detail. So if we look at the next slide, this would show what happens if we expand the detail, and we're able to actually communicate directly here. So clients are able to click into the system and update their recommendation. They're able to put in, you know, a picture or a comment, and it's auditable, right? So we can see who's put in what when, and we can understand it, and in a real-time manner that allows Chris and the team who are doing the type of desktop assessment to understand, okay, maybe the risk profile for the protection in the spray paint booth was not as good as it could be, but the clients actually come back and said, yes, we've done this, or we're doing this. So we're able to make those decisions in much greater real time. And the next slide really shows us again, you know, the type of how it all rolls up. So we looked at more detail at these earlier in the presentation around where our recommendations come from, but on a client by client basis, you're able to see the broad categories, whether they're physical type of recommendations or human element, and drill into that information. So it's all available. Like I say, I understand there's lots of other systems, but I guess you should be looking for a system like this as a client with your broker, with your insurer, to make sure that you're able to have that real-time dialogue. Just one sort of nod to the future again, and yes, next slide please. Sorry, we launched our digital risk engineer last week. Very future focused in so much as it's a connected solution to monitor the health of buildings and assets. It uses the Internet of Things. It looks at a client's building and really starts to analyze, I guess, recommendations in real time. So the idea is to monitor particular systems and use the data at an earlier stage to predict and prevent an issue. So that this is where I kind of see recommendations going. It won't be just those type of recommendations that we make through either visiting a location or perhaps using a tool like risk scanning to get more of a portfolio view. I think we'll see more real-time information like this available to you as clients in the near future. So at that point, I'll hand back to Tim, who's going to sum up for us.
Thanks, Jonathan and Chris. It'd be great to see everyone's faces in terms of, is there lots of nodding or more, pensive thoughts around, is this of value? And hopefully we can flush some of that out in terms of some Q&A. But so to conclude, we hope we've been able to share some thinking with you, an insight around the importance of risk control and how this information is used. As I say, the pricing tool is fundamental to underwriting, but clearly it's around the data and the information that is building the picture of your own risk. So to repeat a point from earlier, that it is important that each risk is considered and priced on its merits. So the quality of information is key in the differentiation of your risk and portraying the risk that allows underwriters to make those informed decisions. Sometimes we accept that it's not always about that more detailed information. Sometimes it can be about getting to us in a timelier manner so we can give it full consideration. I know this was a topic covered at Airmic last week, but as Chris referenced, late and incomplete information means we may have to take a worst case assumption in terms of looking at that pricing. As we touched on, important to focus on risk improvement and mitigation. So what activity is taking place to manage and mitigate risk? And this information is key in differentiation at that point in time. And then I think there's a key point here in terms of engagement plans, and an engagement plan through the annual cycle should be agreed and actioned by all parties, not just around renewal or 60 days of renewal. Each client will have different internal processes and requires different expectation management, and it's important we understand this so that we can deliver appropriately. Jonathan touched on technology, and technology we've used recently to facilitate virtual market visits to insured locations, and new solutions to market like Cube and Digital Risk Engineer are built around remote collaboration that helps bring clients closer to our experts and to solve complex risks virtually. So I think it's important to focus on areas that are of interest to underwriters, breed curiosity, develop dialogue, and we should all try and make these conversations outside the renewal timeline more beneficial. And with that, we welcome any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tim, John, and Chris. I think that was absolutely wonderful. And I think, Tim, just at the end there, when you were summing up, you reinforced the importance of data and the importance of timely delivery and its use in how you assess a risk and how coverage is priced. And we have a question from the audience, which I think relates to that very much, and they're citing something of a specific example. They're referencing a US site that they have where there is minimal flood exposure, and they've determined this using FEMA digital data for a third quarter. But they say that the property underwriter has applied an increase in deductible for flood claims events, and they're just wondering how you could resolve a dispute about that when trying to build your program. I mean, is it really about collaboration and sort of the timely use of data, or?
So I'll kick off on that one. I think a couple of points on that. One would be to understand more from the underwriting perspective of why that location specifically. What is the information that they're using to come to that conclusion that it's more of an issue? So you could maybe assume that there is more of a trend of losses of that nature in a specific area of the US or wherever it might be. It's, these are questions not specific to the US. That's a generic question around understanding of risk. And therefore, I think it's drilling down into that specific example and what information is available that can influence the reason as to why a decision has been made, and an explanation to the client and to the broker of the rationale behind that. That's around the dialogue. And that's something that we would encourage to understand why decisions are being made. I don't think it's a question of opening up the pricing tool, but I think it's important to understand why decisions lead to conclusions and what influence a specific location. It could be the values under insurance at that point, whatever it may be, that drives that thinking. But that's where the discussion needs to be, and the client, the dialogue, direct or otherwise, needs to take place for that understanding. Would be my view on that.
Great, thank you very much. We have a second question that's just come through, which is, what is the time frame for the launching of all sections of Site Forward? Because are they all gone live, or is it sort of a staged release?
So, Alex, it is a staged release. The slides that I showed you of the dashboard, the wider sort of picture, the second one in my part of the deck there, it is live. So we use it at the moment for representing all of our survey data. It feeds in, we've got global risk maps feeding into there. So that's an AXA XL proprietary solution that we've developed that pulls in lots of different NatCat data that we're able to kind of visualize in there. We can pull in legacy data. So, if you change insurer, we can maintain recommendations and maintain data as well. So that's all live. The other systems that we have sit around that at the moment, so that you're still able to access that data, maybe just not directly through Site Forward, but we've had a long release program since integration. So this brings together kind of the best of both of the AXA and the XL visualization tools. We're on release 10 or 11 at the moment. There's an iterative release throughout the month of October, and then we've got a couple more coming, but it's there at the moment. Probably that answer gives you some idea of what I've been doing for the last 18 months as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it looks very impressive. I mean, especially the preservation of historical data and legacy data. If you've moved insurance, must be extremely useful. Or let's switch tack slightly for a different question here. We talked a lot about recommendations, and I'm just interested. What's the difference between? I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but what's the difference between a requirement and a recommendation? Because a lot of the things that you were suggesting were recommendations. I would have thought some of them would have been requirements. So where's the dividing line there?
Yeah, so I'm happy to take this one on, Alex. In terms of the difference between the requirements and the recommendations, the vast majority of those types within our reports and following on from surveys are recommendations. Okay, so we're wanting to work with the client, we're wanting to help them to improve their risk profile. And just because we make a recommendation, it doesn't mean that that's the only possible solution. Okay, we're happy to have a discussion with the client, with the risk manager, with the broker, and work to find a solution that's going to work for everybody. Now, that's not to say there can't ever be occasions where there is a requirement in place, and that would normally be something that is really critical at particular sites. So an example that could spring to mind would be around flammable liquid handling. And if we had electrics within that area that weren't suitable to be within there, then that's obviously deficiency. And in those cases, the underwriter could say, okay, this has to be considered as a requirement. But 99% of these points are recommendations. They're not required to be completed, but obviously completing them is going to help you to improve your risk profile and to make your business more attractive to insurers. But most importantly, it's going to help you to protect your business, which is what it all comes down to at the end of the day. We're both trying to prevent losses, whether we're looking at it from an insurance standpoint, from a broker standpoint, or from a client standpoint.
Sorry, small technological problem. And you know, there's lots of different parts, obviously, of the risk management process. I mean, where can people get help to understand recommendations and what needs to be done? I mean, is it best to go direct to AXA, or you know, are there other places that you would go for that kind of assistance?
Again, I mean, I'm happy to answer this one. So in terms of if there are recommendations presented, first of all, they should be clearly discussed at the time of the survey, and during the closeout meeting, the engineer that was conducting that survey would discuss them with the site. So there shouldn't ever be a report coming through that has recommendations that are a surprise. Now, that said, there can be some cases whereby the engineer conducts a visit on site, and whenever he leaves, he's driving home and maybe thinks, in actual fact, there is an additional recommendation that should be made. And that would be included within the report that the site would see. But normally they would follow up before that with a mail just to outline why that additional recommendation had been presented. Now, we also discussed the follow-up phone calls that would happen a few weeks after the survey. And that gives the sites the opportunity to discuss those recommendations. If there is any areas that they need further clarity or unsure about, they can obviously discuss that at that time. However, we'd encourage them to get in touch before that and speak to us before that event so that they could fully understand the recommendation and start to bring around a plan for how they're going to approach that recommendation. Now, again, going back to the conversation about requirements or recommendations, that could be the case that they do agree with the recommendation, they're happy to implement it. It could be the case that upon reflection, they actually don't think that that recommendation should be completed. And at that point, we can have an open discussion and a dialogue about why. Or it could be that, okay, they understand that that should be completed, but in actual fact, there's reasons. It could be CapEx reasons, it could be operational reasons that it can't be undertaken. And at that point, they would then be able to look at sort of alternatives. But to answer the question that you asked a second ago, it's important that they have that discussion with us because we've made the recommendation, we've been on site, and we understand the context in which that recommendation was made and what some of those potential other solutions would be. So in the first instance, it would be the insurer and the engineer that actually made those initial recommendations.
Brilliant, thanks very much. And one more question, perhaps around the issue of timeline. Can you give us any indication of what kind of timeline you look at for the renewal cycle? I mean, we were saying earlier that, you know, we need to now, we think, have more of a running communication and running relationship all throughout the year. I don't know, Tim, whether you're able to tell us anything about that.
Yeah, happy to say that, Alex. Thank you. You know, it's a great question, isn't it? And it's a huge topic at the moment. And I wonder whether remote working is driving the conversation. And in reality, it's kind of strange that we're working remotely and then thinking about it, where ideally it's harder, or in reality it could be harder. But is there advantages of being remote and sharing data and information and access to individuals? So I don't think there's a panacea of one specific date where we should aim for. I think it's more of an annual process that has a renewal date in the calendar year, and clearly that brings focus. but the dialogue should take place continually through the year, and that should be both with underwriter and the risk control team. You know, where I've seen it work best in the past, and I'm pretty sure some of these individuals are on the call, is where the other factor is that, you know, from a property perspective, it's not just an AXA XL discussion. You know, if you've got a schedule of carriers, they need to see and hear the same information, and sharing that with your wider market diverts concerns that may come through the renewal process. So I think it's important that, yeah, AXA XL may be leading the program and we may be leading the risk control aspect, but it's important that clients share and develop that relationship with their markets that are on the schedule, and therefore can address concerns that other carriers may have. Our appetite may be different to another carrier, and I think it's important that those areas are flushed out and it just doesn't become satisfying what AXA XL may be focusing on. So, you know, from the renewal timeline aspect, I think it's important those renewal timelines are agreed with carriers. You know, where you build in time that says how long does insurers need to work through some of the areas that Jonathan and Chris have articulated, so that we can come back to you with an articulated and well thought out response that hasn't been hindered by lack of time. So in building that renewal timeline, I would absolutely encourage brokers to come to carriers and say, okay, how long do you need to give this the appropriate focus and due diligence in giving us an answer and a dialogue that we can appreciate and understand. Now, it may not be one that you agree with, but it needs to be well thought out and articulated. So different clients, and touching on the point of access to information, data gathering, you know, some global clients that we have are in 100+ territories. We don't underestimate that data gathering. Others may not have that global footprint. So I don't think it's a one size fits all, but what it is it should be a unique conversation to that individual client that comes to us and says, okay, for my risk, how long do you need? So I'd encourage that dialogue to take place, and that's certainly something that we would entertain some conversation around.
I think that's really great, Tim. I mean, you know, a slight plug for Airmic. I think that's one of those really practical ways that we can, you know, we'll do what we're always talking about in terms of working together and collaborating. So I think that's fantastic. Thank you. One final question from the audience is that different insurers and surveyors often refer to different engineering standards in property. So, for example, LPC or NFPA or FM Global, etc. And this can sometimes cause confusion as to which one to follow. So is it possible for you to share with us sort of which standard AXA XL favors or follows?
So we favor, from a property point of view, Alex, we favor NFPA as perhaps one of the more global ones. Although we're able to take a view. So we understand that everybody doesn't always work to NFPA standards. Like I say, that would be our benchmark, but we've got the ability to review local standards against NFPA perhaps, or review what they have against our own internal standards. But for the purposes of answering the question, we would use NFPA as our go-to standard.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, excuse me, it appears that there are no more questions pending from the audience. There is one process question from one of them, which is, would it be possible to obtain the slides afterwards? I don't know if you're comfortable sharing them or not, but obviously our audience seems quite interested in reviewing what was an excellent presentation, if possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we're happy to sign that picture of the 3-boy band as well, if you like.
As we were saying beforehand, everybody in their suits, which I haven't seen for months. Yes, great profile.
Let's do that.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Well, unless there are any other questions, and I'll give you time to ping them across while I say a few final words, but thank you very much to AXA XL and to Tim, Jonathan, and Chris for presenting this morning. I think obviously property is very much at the core of the insurance world, and I think that was extremely informative for the membership. So thank you all for speaking with us today. And if you have any further questions that you would like to send across to them that occur to you later on, please feel free to be in touch with myself or my colleague Matt, and we will do our very best to get some answers for you. So thank you very much, all of you, for attending, and to AXA XL again for presenting.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.